Hello everyone, we're here at the Paris Institute of Advanced Studies. I'm here with Professor Gordon Cumming, your professor here at the Institute of Advanced Studies in Paris, but also at Cardiff University. My name is Thibaud Harrois, I'm a senior lecturer in British politics at the Université Sorbonne Nouvelle. Gordon, your research is on Anglo-French relations and especially in Africa, and when we talk about Anglo-French relations in Africa, over the colonial and also post-colonial eras, there is a tendency to talk of rivalry. How accurate is this term?
Well, it's certainly true that Anglo-French relations in Africa have always been marked by rivalry, and this is usually traced back to the 1898 Fashoda incident, when France had to abandon its territorial claims to Sudan and allow the British Empire to run from Cairo to Cape Town. This led to what is known as the Fashoda syndrome, France's obsession that the British and Americans are somehow trying to take over Francophone Africa, and it was only partly assuaged by the 1904 Entente Cordiale. So the rivalry between Britain and France continued throughout the post-colonial decades, and we can see it, for example, in the fact that the British and French bequeathed very different political systems to their former empires, and they supported different models of economic development. So the British obviously supported the neoliberal structural adjustment austerity measures in Africa, whereas France opposed the so-called pensée unique of the World Bank. We also saw it in security matters. So during the Nigerian Civil War, Britain and France actually were on opposing sides. And this rivalry, it existed, but it was always attenuated by three factors. The Cold War, both Britain and France had a duty to keep their former empires in the Western orbit. The fact that there were Franco-African summits, and ultimately the fact that Britain didn't care that much about Africa. It was always accused of benign neglect.
British Prime Minister Tony Blair and French President Jacques Chirac tried to encourage Anglo-French cooperation via the Saint-Malo II agreement. How successful was this attempt?
Well, it's certainly true that the Tony Blair government and the Chirac administration, as well as Lionel Jospin's modernising government, wanted to change the relationship between Britain and France in Africa. And Saint-Malo was in 1998, exactly 100 years after the Fashoda incident. In a sense, there was a need to work together in and on Africa, and that is what they pledged to do. In order to do that, they set up a rather useful, but at the same time ad hoc institutional framework. And that included, for example, within the Franco-British Summit, there was a distinct Africa chapter and a greater ministerial representation. There were 6 monthly meetings between the Foreign Ministry Africa directorates. There were joint ministerial statements, joint ministerial visits. There was an exchange program between foreign ministry staff and also defense ministry staff. There were, at the European Union, the Africa Working Group started to meet weekly rather than monthly. And at the United Nations, as from 1997, Britain, France, and the United States worked together in the P3, the Permanent Three, and effectively coordinated their position on United Nations Security Council resolutions, many of which dealt with Africa. With that institutional framework, Britain and France did have some success in working together on poverty. So Britain and its Department for International Development knew that it could only tackle the Millennium Development Goals if it worked in Francophone as well as Anglophone Africa. So both Britain and France supported the Education for All initiative. Britain backed France on its Unitaid programme, which was for vaccines, and France supported Britain for its IFF, International Finance Facility on Immunisation. There were also silent partnerships between the two. In addition, there was some attempt at diplomatic coordination. So France supported Britain in its quest to ensure sanctions against Robert Mugabe's Zimbabwe regime, and Britain supported France in its need to have UN security resolutions for its military intervention in Côte d'Ivoire. But really it was in the realm of security cooperation that Britain and France worked together most effectively. They participated in each other's military training exercises. They established a network of West African regional military training centres. They contributed to EuroRecamp, which was a European training initiative. And above all, they worked together on common security and defence policy missions, which were military in nature, and which included a mission in the Democratic Republic of Congo, known as Artemis, in 2003. So all of that said and done, I wouldn't say that Anglo-French cooperation was a huge success. Ultimately, the visits were only occasional, the statements were only occasional, the money often wasn't actually delivered, and there was never really an entente formidable as they had promised. Britain and France were never really partners of choice. Why was that? Well, Britain and France never had the same natural affinity that we see with the special relationship between Britain and America, and nor did they have the dense institutional ties that we see between France and Germany. They were hindered by mistrust, different extractive capacities, and sometimes different priorities. And ultimately, nothing was really forcing them to work together. And that's a point I want to come back to at the end.
What was the impact of Brexit on the relations between France and Britain in Africa?
Well, obviously, Brexit had a damaging impact on UK-French relations in general. But Brexit also made it harder to see the shared interests and benefits from working together in Africa. And this was partly linked to the fact that the institutional ties between Britain and France were quite ad hoc and informal. So the Anglo-French summit stopped working between 2018 and 2022, and it was only resuscitated by Rishi Sunak in 2023. Then there was the merger of Britain's Department for International Development with the Foreign and Commonwealth Office, now called the FCDO. It was no longer clear who should be speaking to whom, because in France, there was no French development minister. So there was an institutional problem there. Another institutional problem was the fact that Britain was no longer in the European Union, so could no longer take part in the Africa Working Group meetings or in the CODEV meetings. And this all meant that when it came to things like poverty reduction, there wasn't the same alignment of positions. Britain was actually cutting its aid back to 0.5% at a time when France was increasing its assistance to 0.55%. And Britain was also using aid via what's called aid for trade in order to sponsor post-Brexit deals around Africa and to encourage British businesses to invest in Africa. In terms of diplomatic coordination, this was also more difficult. Britain and France simply were not aligning their position on issues which were of great importance to both. So, restoration of cultural artifacts, there was no common position. Apologies or reparations for past colonial transgressions, no common position. partnerships. Everybody wanted partnerships, but with whom and for what purpose? And then the pandemic. Britain and France really didn't work together on the pandemic at all. Britain opposed any waiver on the patent for vaccine production, whereas France supported this. Britain was not really in favour of Africa manufacturing its own vaccines, whereas France wanted to set up a factory in Senegal. Britain was hoarding its vaccines in a process known as vaccine nationalism. France was engaged in vaccine diplomacy. In other words, France was giving vaccines through COVAX, but earmarking them as specifically French. So during Brexit, cooperation collapsed, except in one field, which was security. So security cooperation continued with Opération Serval, France's military adventure in Mali, when Britain provided logistical support. Then Opération Barkhane in 2014, Britain supplied 3 Chinook helicopters and also non-combat troops to the UN mission in Mali. And the UK also offered special forces to Cuba in northern Mali. But security cooperation was hard outside the common security and defence policy framework. It was hard because Britain was adopting quite a strong nationalist position, promoting global Britain. So Britain was engaging in support, for example, for an Ethiopian regime, which was brutal and engaged in human rights violations at a time when the European Union had the Ethiopian government under sanctions.
What does the re-election of Donald Trump mean for the relations between France and Britain in Africa?
I spoke to British and French diplomats back in November, and I had the distinct impression that the French were more enthusiastic about cooperation than the British were. Now, I imagine that that is still the case, not least as France has been forced out of Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger, as well as being required to withdraw militarily from Côte d'Ivoire, Senegal, and Chad. But that said, the arrival and the re-election of Donald Trump has changed everything, because Donald Trump and his administration is posing an unprecedented challenge to the multilateral rules-based order in which France and Britain both believe deeply, right? So the British government under Labour is a progressive realist government, and the Macron administration has always been a largely realist administration. They know the benefits of working together. Examples of benefits: when Britain and France cooperate, they can garner 2/3 of the votes on the UN Security Council. When Britain and France cooperate, they have an enormous convening power. They can bring others on board. They can reduce the risk of being played off by African leaders on specific issues. They can promote common values at a time when emerging powers such as China, Russia, and Turkey are actually promoting values which are not those of the global North, and which are, in some cases, quite problematic. And when Britain and France work together, they can promote common interests, tackling migration, tackling terrorism, mitigating the effects of climate change. So it's against that backdrop, when we see Donald Trump in the White House, that we think, well, do Britain and France need to work together more closely in areas such as development? So what's happened in development? Donald Trump has suspended US aid, which contributed $15 billion in 2023 to Africa. He has initiated the withdrawal of America from the World Health Organization, which basically 15% of whose budget came from the United States. And the Trump administration this week alone has begun to talk about disentangling itself from the Sustainable Development Goals. So when you have all that going on, Britain and France may be required to step up to the plate and show joint leadership in the absence of the American hegemon. Now, what form will that leadership take? It will probably not be more overseas development assistance, because Britain now stands at 0.3% of GNP in terms of aid. And France is also talking about a 40% cut. So what can Britain and France do? Well, they can mobilize others. This multi capacity they have to convene others and persuade them, other donors and also private donors such as the Gates Foundation, to plug the gap in crucial areas like reproductive rights, which will be seriously affected by the Trump administration. Britain and France could also jointly invest in infrastructure projects, the Agence Française de Développement on the one hand, and British international investors on the other. And in some ways, this is an opportunity for Britain and France, because if this Sustainable Development Goals end up being set to one side or challenged, is this a moment perhaps to reset the North-South agenda? Because the SDGs were always incredibly diffuse and could never really be measured. Is there a way of ensuring that the Sustainable Development Goals better tackle growth and job creation, which is a key issue for Africa? Diplomatic coordination? Well, that might be more ad hoc, but one case springs to mind, and that is South Africa, because Elon Musk, who was born in Pretoria, has mobilized the American administration to take action against the South African government because it perceives that government to be grabbing land from white Afrikaner farmers. Now, the Trump administration has suspended aid and may well deny South Africa easy access to American markets. South Africa is a key strategic partner of Britain and France. Will they work together to support and defend South Africa? Now, I'll end on the security note, because this in some ways might be the most important. Trump and his administration have for some time been threatening to withdraw from the Sahel. Now, the Sahel, from an American point of view, is a European problem, mainly a migration problem, partly a security problem. If Britain and France have to work together more in the Sahel, how can they do so? Especially since France has been thrown out of the Sahel by the alliance of Sahelian states. Well, at the moment, one way to do so is through what's called the Alliance Sahel, which is a massive coordinated development platform involving 27 donors. Much more could be done in that kind of framework to support the countries of the Sahel. Britain and France could work on counter-terrorism more closely and counter-migration in places like Niger and Libya. Britain and France could support ad hoc military coalitions such as the MNJTF in Nigeria, Lake Chad, which is combating Boko Haram. Britain and France could equally work together in supporting the Accra initiative, which would protect western coastal states of Africa, places like Cote d'Ivoire. But, and I'm going to end on this note, at times there may be nothing that Britain and France can really do. If we take the case of the Democratic Republic of Congo, which was recently invaded by M23 rebels supported by Rwanda, Britain and France were left powerless. France, because it had been implicated in the 1994 genocide in Rwanda, and Britain because of its failed immigration scheme in Rwanda. So this left a clear pathway for American intervention, and the Congolese government has asked the Trump administration for security guarantees in the Congo in exchange for massive mineral rights. And that to me, is eerily reminiscent of what is going on right now in Ukraine. And perhaps I could take advantage of you being here to ask you a question about that. What, in your view, does Trump's re-election mean for Anglo-French security cooperation in Europe, and particularly in Ukraine?
Yeah, I think you're right to mention this. And of course, you were talking earlier about Saint-Malo and the Saint-Malo Agreement in 1998. And of course, at the time, when the French and the British started cooperating on security, there was this idea that this could lead to something else at the European level. And at the time, there was also the rest of this long tradition of the Euro-Atlantic security dilemma between France and Britain. And Britain insisted that efforts at the European level should not duplicate efforts to strengthen NATO, and that NATO should remain the cornerstone for European security. Now, maybe because of frustration of things not happening at the European level, the French and the British decided to foster their cooperation in 2010. They signed two very important treaties, the Lancaster House treaties on, both nuclear cooperation and also cooperation on conventional weapons, and also trying to establish this combined joint expeditionary force between them. And then there were a few challenges that you mentioned as well in your presentation, in your answers to my questions. Brexit, obviously, and of course the AUKUS deal that damaged trust between France and Britain. Now, France and Britain have been trying to rebuild that trust and rebuild their cooperation. You mentioned the 2023 summit, Franco-British summit, and of course this is a very important date in the history of rebuilding cooperation between the two countries. And since then, and because of the context of the war in Ukraine, I think France and Britain realized they needed to move on and trying to cooperate a bit more. Now, the re-election of Donald Trump is definitely creating a different context. And France and Britain are once again the two leaders in trying to convene, again, a word that you use, convene powers or countries that could participate in that coalition of the willing that they are trying to build. But that doesn't mean France and Britain can do it on their own. They definitely need to include more countries, European countries possibly, and also the USA. Nothing can be done if the USA doesn't agree to be there as a backstop or whatever form their involvement may take in the future. So France and Britain have very important stakes in there. There are very important powers. There are definitely the convening powers in Europe, but there's still this question of what you need to do with NATO. Should it be transformed? Should the Europeans play a greater role in NATO? What form can this participation take, this reinforced cooperation take within NATO? And what should be the role of the USA in there? So I think lots of what you said comes to, is coherent with what's happening in Ukraine, and we can see the echoes of the two issues. And I think this was a very interesting discussion and very challenging thoughts as well. So thank you very much for this, Gordon.
And thank you, Thibaud.